joining us in this seminar. I'd like to start telling you, for those who don't know about LASC, we are a membership-based organization since 1996, and we're based in Dublin. We share a passion for real social change in Latin America and Ireland. We believe in equality, social justice, and equal cultural, social, political, civil, and economic rights for all. With these events, we try to expose and challenge the current issues and injustice in Latin America and in Ireland, and through public awareness raising, development education, information exchanges, and solidarity campaigns. So we are doing this these webinars because they were planned originally in a different way. They were face-to-face, but due to the current situation with the COVID-19, we've been forced to do it online. But on the other hand, this allowed us to reach more places and more people. More people can be in contact with us, like Luciana and Chris, our speakers tonight. They both are in different places, and it's easier for everybody. I have to say that in April, the government of Ireland committed to undertaking a full economic and sustainable impact assessment of the EU-Mercosur trade agreement. To this end, the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation commissioned a study that involved an analysis of sustainability impacts that the trade agreement could have in Ireland, Mercosur countries, as well as third countries, encompassing social, environmental, and human rights impacts. LASC, along with other organizations and our panelist, Chris O'Connell, was consulted as a stakeholder. After the consultation, we decided to organize the webinar to talk widely with more people who shares our concerns about the deal. In this webinar, we'll talk about some of the points LASC brought to the meeting with the business department. Okay, so I'd like to introduce briefly our speakers. We have Luciana Giotto, who is a CONICET career researcher based at the National University of San Martin. She's from Argentina. She's researcher at the Transnational Institute and member of the ATTAC Argentina. She specializes in issues related to globalization, from international economic relations, especially issues of trade and investment, governance, and she'll be talking about the economic impacts of Mercosur deal and more about the legal framework. And our second speaker tonight is Chris O'Connell. He's a postdoctoral Caroline Fellow with Dublin City University and Anti-Slavery International in London. His current research focuses on the relationship between climate change and contemporary forms of slavery in Peru and Bolivia. He'll be focusing on the human rights impacts of the deal, as well as the environmental perspective. This webinar, it's going to be organized with our speakers. Our first speaker will be Luciana, and secondly, Chris. But before to start, I would like to remind you that this webinar is going to be tomorrow in our YouTube channel, as well. All our previous webinars, they are in that YouTube channel. So if you are interested in our previous webinars, you can check the YouTube channel. Also, I'd like to remind you guys that all the participants are silent, but you can communicate with us through the chat, and there is a section of questions and answers that we will respond after after our speakers. And originally we had planned an introduction from Juliana, who unfortunately she couldn't make it today with us. It's about Brazil and the context in the Mercosur. So I just want to read a brief important points that she told us that we should remark. So the document is called EU-Mercosur Deal, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And many concerns about the EU-Mercosur deal have been raised by an array of social movements and specialists from distinct fields all over the world. The Green European Free Alliance Front in the European Parliament it's a great opposition to the deal. They have been arguing the negotiation process has had one constant: secrecy, opacity, and lack of democratic control, and that its impact studies have been insufficient in the EU and non-existent in Mercosur. In 2019, European coordination of the Via Campesina and more than 340 social organizations wrote to the EU to stop the negotiation of the deal. And 600 scientists and 300 organizations wrote an open letter in the Science magazine sharing their worries on the impact of the Mercosur deal on environment. Many of these concerns were also shared by national Mercosur governments and EU states, but were eliminated by the election of Jair Bolsonaro, as argued in the study carried out by the Green EFA bloc. In fairness, it is still not a consensus in the Latin American economic bloc that the deal is positive. The Argentinian president, Alberto Fernandez, said that he will not sign the deal in the current terms, and argued during his visit to Europe earlier this month that asymmetries will harm the Argentine industry. There had never been an agrarian reform in Brazil, and plantations are the typical model of the production in Brazilian agriculture. Those land has been a source of conflict through our history. Indigenous people and Quilombolas land and cultural rights were assured for the first time by the 1988 Constitution. But the recent ideological attacks and changes in the process of land demarcation have been increased and the violence in rural areas. One of the first measures implemented by Bolsonaro government was transferring the demarcation of indigenous territories from FUNI, linked to the Ministry of Justice, and the demarcation of Quilombolands from the National Institute of Colonization and Agrarian Reform, ICRA. To the Department of Agriculture, the main interest in opening the way for the business agreement. There is also an ongoing project of the government to allow mining, tourism, livestock, and exploration of water resources and hydrocarbons and on indigenous land. Bolsonaro had already anticipated such intentions when in presidential campaign he said that the Indians will be emancipated under his government and promised to allow commercial and exploitation and sale of indigenous Quilombola land. It goes beyond an assimilationist approach to ethnic minorities. It is a genocide act. The environment minister at the time that the deal was signed was Eduardo Salles, a person convicted of environmental crime. He falsified maps of ecological reserve areas when he was Secretary of the Environment of the state of Sao Paulo. His campaign leaflets showed images of gun munitions, promissory to end rural conflicts, and the left. With such state incentives to violence, conflicts in the rural areas have increased. Well, in 2018, CIMI reported that there were 109 cases of land invasions, illegal exploitation of natural resources, and various damage to property. Just in the first 9 months of 2019, partial and preliminary data from semi-recorded 160 of such cases in indigenous land in Brazil. There was also an increase in the number of murders registered, 135 in 2018, with the highest number of cases in Roraima, 62, and Mato Grosso do Sul, 38, where there is a great concentration of indigenous people and lands. In 2019, more than 300 human rights activists were killed. 2/3 of the total killing took place in Latin America. 40% of those killed worked on land, indigenous peoples, and environmental issues. The National Spatial Research Institute published last November new data confirming the Amazon deforestation increased by 20.5% from August 2018 to July 2019, reaching a 9,762 square meters area. It's about the worst increasing percentage in the last 2 decades. And what the president did, he did fire the president of the research institute that released these figures. It has already been shown that the deforestation is to open space for agricultural activities and animal exploitation, livestock, with impact on local communities once it affects the local fauna and flora. Food sovereignty, and dispossesses people illegally and impacts hugely the environment. LASC and BLF endorses the claim of indigenous people from APIB, Association of Indigenous People from Brazil. We're asking for Europe's solidarity, not to ratifying the Mercosur deal, just like creating laws that can curb, give transparency, traceability, and punishment to the companies that buy products that come from conflict areas or indigenous land. It is required that all parts being state, companies and civil society assume the responsibility in relation to the problem that the climate crisis represents to humanity in the 21st century. The moment is dramatic and urgent. Thanks very much. Okay. As I said, our first speaker will be Luciana. So thanks very much, Luciana. So whenever you want to start.
Okay. Can you hear me well? Everything's fine. Okay. Just let me know if there's any technical problem. So first of all, good afternoon. For me, it's like 3 o'clock, 20 past 3. So it's good afternoon in a winter afternoon in Argentina. To start, I would like to say that my main point for this small speech I will bring here is to try to show maybe the general characteristics of the Mercosur-EU agreement. Probably because one of the main things that has been said, at least on the Mercosur side of the Atlantic, is that this is like the treaty, the agreement that has been negotiated for the longest amount of years in the history of the treaties, right? Because they said, well, we are very happy to end this agreement as we are already on the 20th anniversary of this agreement last year, okay? We had 20 years of negotiations. And that in itself is not a good point in itself to say, well, now that they finished this agreement, we have like, this is a victory in itself. What we can say actually is that an agreement that took 20 years to be concluded was actually concluded in the last 6 months of this period. We saw that the announcement of the agreement was made in the last days of June 2019, last year. But actually, if we see the most active period of negotiations was between Bolsonaro getting to the presidency and June 2019. So we have like the last months of these negotiations were the most active. Why is that? It's because what they usually call this idea of the window of opportunity. They kept saying in these past 20 years, they kept repeating, the presidents and negotiators kept repeating this idea that they had to take advantage of this window of opportunity. And the last window of opportunity was having President Mauricio Macri in Argentina and President Bolsonaro in Brazil. What we finally saw with these two presidents and this window of opportunity in these last 6 months of negotiation in last year is that actually all the red lines, you know, this concept of red lines, we usually mention it in Spanish, is like las líneas rojas, which is this idea of governments kept saying this past 20 years, where we have these red lines, and if we don't get, or we can give until this point, we cannot give beyond this point. For example, in intellectual property rights. For Argentina, this was something important. Or other areas where they said, well, we cannot give you this or this, okay? So we want, for example, what they kept saying in the first years of the negotiation in years 2000, 2001, and especially 2003 and 4, they said, we want 400,000 tons of market taxes for cow meat, for bovine meat, okay, to the European Union. But what they finally agreed was 99,000 tons. So they agreed the 25% of what they originally required from the Mercosur side, okay? So we see that actually these last 6 months of the negotiations were crucial, were very important, because that's where all the red lines were left aside, and all the things that the Mercosur actually required were left aside. So there we have one characteristic, is that actually from the Mercosur side, this agreement, the final agreement that they got, is much worse than what it originally was 20 years ago. This is something important. Why? It's because what it shows, and this is the second point that I want to bring, what the agreement shows is that actually the only beneficiaries, the actors that are going to get something from the agreement on the Mercosur side is the agribusiness industry. So what we see is that actually the real interest behind this agreement for these sectors was the ability to be able to have a better market access in the European Union. So this will have a double impact. On the one hand, it will have an impact on the European side. Probably Chris will mention that afterwards, but I want to bring some things. That is that it will have an impact because you will surely, from the European side, you will surely start importing more meat, especially meat, cow, chicken, and pork. And on the Mercosur side, this sector, the agribusiness sector, is going to be, yes, it's going to have a lot of benefits from this agreement, as they are the ones that actually are getting the benefit from the whole of the agreement, especially in Brazil. Why? Because we have to know that in the past 20 years, the Brazilian food industry is not the agricultures, it's not the peasants, it's the food industry, which is actually based in two big enterprises that are the main producers and exporters globally now of cow, not so much of cow, but for example of pork and poultry. They are the main producers and exporters in the world. So we are talking about big actors. So they are not just small or medium enterprises relating to the agricultural model. They are the big actors. They are actually the ones that are going to gain the more with the agreement. So this will have an impact on our side. Why? Because what we see is that this agreement, and this is a hypothesis that I bring here, this agreement, what it will do is it will bring a double movement. So the first movement is, as I was saying, this movement will deepen the trade asymmetries that already exist between both blocs. I mean, the agreement will not create the asymmetries. The asymmetries are already there. The Mercosur countries have inserted themselves in the global economy as exporters of raw materials, and especially agricultural materials, right? And on the other hand, what we import from the European Union are all products with medium and high technological level. We import vaccines, medicines, we import planes, we import vessels, we import car parts, we import things that have medium and high technological level, okay? Products with high and technological level. From the Mercosur side, no, the technological level is really low. And actually we're talking about, that's why raw materials especially, and food, and yes, and products related to agricultural activities. So what we have there is, so the Mercosur-EU agreement, what it will do, it will deepen the asymmetries between both blocs. So this already exists, but the agreement will deepen this situation. It will not change the situation. It will not improve the situation for the countries in Mercosur. It will not improve industry. On the other hand, what it will do is actually prevent the development of more industries on the Mercosur side. Why? It's because this agreement says, one of the points that it says is that in the period of 10 to 15 years, but the last period is 15 years, the trade conditions between, or actually all the taxes, arancel, oh my God, well, wait, sorry, I got lost in the words.
Tariffs.
Tariffs, thank you. And we'll have to drop to 0, okay? So we have there that, can you hear me well? Because it seems to be frozen.
Yeah, no, can you repeat the last idea?
My connection, maintenance connection seems unstable. No!
We can hear you, but
can you hear me?
Your video is frozen.
You say you can hear me. Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
If you can hear me, then I will go on.
Okay, yeah.
Jafet?
Please.
But I cannot hear you. If you can hear me, I cannot hear you. I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on. It was perfect. And then suddenly it just froze.
Hello, can you hear me?
Okay, if you can hear me, then I will stop my video for a while, and just in case. Okay, I will stop my video, and just in case, because I see Jafet and Christopher completely frozen, and so yeah. I'm not sure what happened. Sorry. So the thing is, I was saying, so the car industry and will have to go to tariff 0 in 15 years time. That's why I'm saying that it would be, what this will do is stop or prevent the car industry or yes, industrial sector in Mercosur, which is one of the only sectors that actually works inside Mercosur. What will happen is that it will have to completely liberalize in the period of 15 years. So what we will see is that the losers of this agreement on the Mercosur side will be the sectors regarding industry. Not only cars, car parts and complete car production, but also we will see that with furniture, with footwear, with clothes, the textile sector will be really affected by these agreements on the Mercosur side, because we see in the rules of origin, rules of origin chapter, we see that some of the regulations regarding how the process of the textiles are made are actually going to be beneficial for the European transnationals, like, I don't know, for example, the big ones like Zara or H&M, or all the ones that can bring some parts of the textile process from India or from China, where the textile sector is much cheaper, right? So that's what we have there. On the other hand, what I was saying is that when the industrial sector is the one that is the most affected by this, we also have the situation where the agribusiness sector is going to be the one that actually has all the gains. And this will have an impact on the Mercosur side. Why it will have an impact on the Mercosur side? Because what we will see is that even though nowadays we see the biotechnological system in the agribusiness sector very widened and very well developed, what we will see is that this will improve, this will deepen in the agrarian sector. We will see more glyphosate, we will see more agrotoxics, and more chemicals being used for the agricultural process. So this is one of the main things that we will see. I don't know if you will be able to see me now. This seems to be frozen anyway. I will keep talking. I hope you can hear me. So what we will see is that there will be deepening of the situation, of the bad situation in the fields for peasants and for people who live on the fields. Why? Why is that? That is because, what we will see is that we already have a problem of deforestation and of health regarding all the chemicals like glyphosate that is used for the growing of soy and for the growing of cereals. And so the situation will not only be a bad situation for example, you were saying, Jafet, before that Juliana was naming, for example, indigenous people and activists and human rights activists on the Mercosur side in Brazil. We see that there is a problem for these people, but we will see that being deepened. How? Well, we will see the more use of these products in the fields. So what we will have is a situation where these people we will see more health problems and environmental problems regarding the use of the widespread use of glyphosates and nicotinoids, for example, and other products that are being really, really bad for the environment and for health of people on this side of the Atlantic. So this is the situation we have in the region. Then on the other hand, what we will see also, and I will finish in a couple of minutes my speech, is that we will also see that there's going to be a pressure. This agreement will bring pressure on regulations on the European side. Why? Because as I said before, as the big winners of this agreement is the agribusiness on the Mercosur side, what we will see is that these big businesses on for example, these big meat producers and exporters in Brazil and Argentina also, of course, they will push to have a European Union that cannot use the precautionary principle when some problem arises. You know that how the final words that appear in the clauses of the agreement show that the precautionary principle is not really a very strong principle inside the agreement. Actually, how do we know that? Well, when you read the agreement, but you can also see the reactions of the negotiators from Argentina, for example, in June, when they announced the ending of the negotiations, they said, for example, our ex-chancellor, our ex-minister of foreign affairs, he said, well, we are happy because the precautionary principle in the European Union has been flexible. Yes, it's more flexible now. And on the other side, we saw that the European Commission said, no, the precautionary principle cannot be touched, and we guarantee the European citizens that we will use the precautionary principle with the first sign that something is not working fine with the certifications of exporters on the Mercosur side. So that is what we see, right? We see a situation where actually politics are the ones that are going to come inside this relationship, bilateral relationship between the two blocs once the agreement starts to work, right, and enters into force. What we will see is actually that we will have politics there. This is not technical, this is not legal even. I mean, the clauses have been written in a way that they are actually held to interpretation, okay? So we will see a lot of interpreting the clauses and a lot of pressure from the Mercosur agribusiness to the European Union, so the European Union does not use the precautionary principle or any of the safeguards that were actually included in the, some safeguards were included inside the agreement, but there will be lots of pressure for this not to happen. So we will see politics entering into the scenario once this agreement enters into force, that we hope it never enters into force, but we know that it will be difficult. And well, I will stop there so we can then have a Chris' opinion. I would really like to know how you are from Ireland, even analyzing the impacts of this agreement. And well, and then I'm available for any further questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Luciana. So now we will have Christopher. Thanks very much, Christopher. So
okay,
where you want?
Thanks, Japhet, and thanks very much, Luciana, for that. I think that you know should work well, hopefully, with what I have to say. So, in terms of my interest in this area, I can't remember if it was mentioned to start, but I previously I was coordinator of LASC, and it was sort of during my time as coordinator that this issue came on the agenda, particularly when there was a leak of some documents by Greenpeace in late 2017 of one of the final rounds of negotiation, and revealing some of the details. And so this, I suppose, isn't a focus of my main research project at the moment, but it's a subject that I'm interested in, and myself with some other scientists, including I think one who's on the listening in today, put together a paper that tried to propose some possible ways that this agreement could be done, or trade agreements in general could be done in less damaging and less harmful ways, particularly with regard to the power dynamics that Luciana was talking about, and how to sort of redress some of that imbalance. But in regard to this agreement, you know, there is a deal done. It's not available, the final version available yet, but there, you know, the question really, I suppose, is it going to go ahead in its current format or not? And so it's sort of that question that I was hoping to look at. Is it possible for me to share a screen, Japhet, or saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
You check.
Okay, Alba. Otherwise, I can just talk. It's not essential.
Do you have the share screen, the green bottom?
I do, but it's saying that it's disabled by the host. Sorry, I'm not sure if that's yourself or that's Alba.
I'll check with Alba if you want to go on, and I'll
okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess in terms of okay, I can do it now. Yeah, so it should work. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, so I mean, what I was saying was about this agreement, sort of not now or not ever, and I guess that relates somewhat to the thing that Luciana was talking about. So my background is really in politics, in Latin American politics, and so that's kind of my interest in this. Although part of my work also looks at human rights, but one of the things about this deal, I guess, is pretty much what Luciana was just saying, which is that there were going to be winners in this, but then there were also going to be losers. And so just these two quotes side by side seem to represent a little bit of that picture. So we have the executive director of the Association of Brazilian Beef Exporters, who sees this as a win-win situation, whereas a more left-wing member of the European Parliament calls it a lose-lose. In truth, I think there are fairly clear winners and losers. And when we're talking then about the context, in particular the context of Latin America and South America, we're talking about a context that is characterized historically since the time of the conquest by inequality, both, I guess, within the region, the most unequal region in the world in terms of the distribution of wealth, and also obviously globally between regions. So, these photograph that shows the sort of wealth and poverty that can live side by side in the region, and also research by Oxfam mentioned there that talks about how this inequality works to deny rights to large swathes of the population in Latin America. And so when a deal is done like this, the talk tends to be about sort of national or regional benefits that will accrue. In particular, I suppose the one that comes across most clearly is GDP per capita, and that this will lead to growth, with the assumption of being, of course, that growth will, that the rising tide will raise all boats. But I mean, that's the history of Latin America proves repeatedly over and over that is not what happens. That in fact, with a few exceptions and some also some historical periods where that has been less the case, but over the longer trajectory, what we see is a small group within the region that win quite substantially from things like this. Luciana has identified clearly the agribusiness industry in this particular case that's risen to significant prominence, particularly in recent times since the end of the commodities boom. The region has sort of pivoted from being primarily focused on hydrocarbons and minerals to a bit more of a focus on cash crops. But the other aspect then, of course, is that there are these losers as well, who are exploited for their labor, and then there is the case of the environment itself, which is also the site of the exploitation over centuries. And just, I mean, not to go off topic completely, but the case historically of guano in Peru sort of, I think, captures a lot of those dynamics. So guano is bird droppings, but in the 1840s, for about 40 years, it was referred to as white gold. It's a very sodium-rich fertilizer, and there was huge demand for it in Europe. And there was huge demand for it in Europe primarily because of the monocropping that was taking place there had depleted the soils, and so European soils were poor. And there was this source of great soil richness in Latin America. The British established a monopoly there, British interest, primarily because they were debts owed by the Peruvian state, and those were leveraged to gain a monopoly over this. There was a labor shortage at the time, so and while slavery had been abolished, legal slavery, slave labor in the form of Chinese coolies were brought to the islands off the coast to dig the guano. The money that went mainly to the wealthy elites, who squandered a lot of it. And at the end of the boom, when the bust that followed, when all the guano was gone, Peru ended up further indebted, and that debt was saddled on its citizens. Meanwhile, some have referred to this as a global metabolic rift, at the very least an unfair exchange in terms of the soils of Europe were enriched, and this potential for soil enrichment that was in Peru was lost. So I don't probably need to go too much into the history of the deal, because Luciana has talked a bit about that. But as she mentioned, and I'll come back maybe to that, but the question was, why now? Why was the deal done now and not before? So up until the sort of middle of the past decade, A lot of the countries in the region were governed by broadly left-wing governments. They took different forms and had different priorities, but tended to be relatively nationalistic and with, not necessarily hugely invested in the protection of the environment, but at the very least looking for a better deal in terms of globally for their country, and having more of a redistributive element to the rents that came from those things. But by 2016, the region had moved to the right, and now the situation is even more so. And so this was, as Luciana mentioned, the window of opportunity for doing this deal. So the deal could not be done, or was not done on the terms on offer during the period of the left-wing governments, but it happened very rapidly after they left power. And so, there's a little bit of what the deal entails, but an interesting point really is that there is resistance within the EU. Ireland is one of the countries that conceivably Ireland's agricultural sector is going to be pretty hard hit. Farmers are not particularly happy, and there are going to be job losses in the agricultural sector in Europe. And some other countries, particularly France and to a degree Austria, have taken a bit of a stand against this. Ireland hasn't really done so yet. And interestingly, the Trade Commissioner is a former minister, an Irish minister, Phil Hogan, who has said that the EU will use leverage to protect the environment. But the mechanisms by which they intend to do that are not especially clear. In terms then of some potential impacts, I think Luciana has mentioned some already, but one aspect in terms of labour is that what's being talked about are more jobs, an increase in jobs, but the jobs primarily are worse jobs. So the jobs are unskilled in the main, and there will be a loss of skilled work, particularly in the industrial sector that Luciana mentioned. So there will be job losses in industry, job gains in agriculture, but the jobs that will be gained, but maybe more in numbers, but I would argue would be considerably less in terms of quality. I think we'll see more flexibilization of that labour, more informality, and conceivably more slave labour. In particular, Brazil's agribusiness industry has a problem with slave labour, one that it has done something to address historically, but that those actions have been largely undone over the last while. And then there's the question of, obviously, of sustainability. So if you're replacing smaller farmers with more intensive agribusiness that uses more chemicals and machinery, then there's obviously sustainability aspects there. I think in the introduction that Juliana wrote, she raised the issue of indigenous rights, and there's huge potential problems with terms of land and displacement here. I'll leave the issue of Bolsonaro specifically for a second, but in terms of in general, agribusinesses, the methods that are used are very hard on the soil, and the soil tends to be depleted, and after a while, and because due to monocropping and due to the heavy use of pesticides, ultimately what often happens then is there's a need to move on and free up more land, and that more land in the history of Latin America, but particularly Brazil, has tended to be in forests, in Amazon, but in other areas as well that have their own environmental specific ecological niches. So that would also bring a loss of biodiversity, which will impact heavily on indigenous rights because they often live through the use of plants, animals, hunting animals, and also a certain amount of exploitation of the environment, but typically in a fairly sustainable manner. And then it raises the issue of free and prior informed consent. This is something that is contained is sort of outlined in both the ILO Convention 169 and also in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but really has not been put into practice in any substantive way anywhere in Latin America that I'm aware of. economic, cultural, and social rights. Issues like food security are raised by this. Water, particularly water quality due to pollution, but also water, also the availability of water, and particularly in the context of climate change, and also rights to a healthy environment. And Luciana mentioned that in terms of pollution. And then we're also seeing, and there's potential for more increased attacks on Indigenous people and human rights defenders in the region as they try to resist any displacements or encroachments into Indigenous territories. And then, like I said, when we see a trade deal like this, what has tended to happen is inequalities become starker. And also then at a national level, dependency and a regional level dependency grows. So Luciana outlined that pretty well in terms of Latin the Mercosur countries producing basic raw materials, while the EU countries will do the more technological and higher value added products. And then there's also the issues around democracy. As was mentioned, I think in Juliana's piece where she talked about the secrecy around the deal and the lack of participation. And potential environmental aspects were mentioned, air and water pollution, but also deforestation that we mentioned, and mining is also not part of the deal, but is certainly part of the reality, increasingly so across the region, particularly small-scale gold mining. Land clearances and forest fires, I think everyone will remember the huge fires in Brazil and elsewhere last summer, and that would certainly is not a coincidence, not a natural phenomenon that relates to processes to clear lands. Often this is being done as a first step toward turning the land into fields for cattle and soy. The loss of biodiversity I mentioned, and also disease is obviously very relevant at the moment in terms of while we're still learning about how COVID-19 came to be. There is some evidence that the deforestation and encroachment into nature is part of the reason for that, but also that the encroachment of different peoples into Indigenous territories can bring diseases. And then there is a big question, I think, that remains unanswered in all of this, is the question of monitoring and enforcement. So first of all, in terms of capacity, what is that capacity? Brazil had some capacity, I think, built up, but it's being rolled back. The Mercosur as an entity has no real capacity. It doesn't really exist as an organization so much as a trading bloc. And then there's the question of political will, and that brings us, I suppose, on the issue of Jair Bolsonaro. And so the question really is, I posed at the start, is the question of this deal not now or not ever? Well, I would say certainly not now. So the actions that I've taken, and I can only mention some of the headline ones here because there are more than I could possibly fit into a talk like this. But in terms of labor, steps have been taken to flexibilize labor. As Bolsonaro has said that workers need to choose between work and rights. They can't have both. And he has basically defunded and undermined what was one of the world's leading systems for detection and prevention of slave labor. And he's disbanded the Ministry of Labor. In terms of Indigenous rights, and the Indigenous agency FUNAI has been, there was an attempt to pass those duties over to the Ministry of Agriculture, which would have been a disaster. The Supreme Court overturned that, but he does seem to have attacked it from within, because FUNAI is now, for the first time in its history, allowing non-Indigenous peoples onto what were considered and sanctioned as Indigenous lands. There have been rising violence and attacks. There have been big encroachments by miners that I've mentioned. And also, I think everyone in the world knows about the attitude he has taken to COVID-19. And that poses a huge risk for Indigenous peoples. A similar disease in the 1980s was estimated to have wiped out 20% of the Yanomami people in Brazil. And then there's documented government states spokespeople saying that this is a good moment to grab land, and land grabbing has been incentivized during the pandemic. The environment, again, massive increases in deforestation. I think Juliana mentioned some figures. I've seen other figures that estimate around 27% in some areas increase of deforestation since Bolsonaro came to power. He's acted to lower standards and dismantle the institutions there to oversee that. Heavier use of GMOs and pesticides, not only in Brazil, also in Argentina. I think 200 pesticides have been approved since Bolsonaro came to power. And there's talk of illegal animal transportation and the fires that were mentioned. And then a general worsening of the situation for human rights across the board, but maybe particularly relevant here toward indigenous people and toward human rights defenders. But there has been a resistance both in Latin America and in Europe. Public opinion is not favorable to the deal in many countries in the EU, and my understanding, only one country needs to formally vote against the agreement in order for it to be stopped in its tracks. We're seeing resistance, particularly in Ireland and in France, by farmers, but also at some other levels in some other areas, including legal challenges. There's a challenge being brought by some organizations, environmental organizations, against the EU, just started recently. And also I mentioned the judicial activism in Brazil, where the Supreme Court and other courts have blocked Bolsonaro, several moves that he's tried to make. And then I think Juliana mentioned the Green group in the European Parliament that is ahead of the opposition to that there. So I mentioned at the start that myself and others have put together a paper that may come out, and there are some advocacy points around that. And this is one which is, on its face, the deal that's there will not massively increase the amounts of tariff-free beef and soy coming into the EU. They're already pretty significant. But the EU is also then complicit in this deforestation that's taking place. And so is this a moment for a pause to be hit? Is this a moment for the EU to negotiate a better deal? Can it use this leverage that Phil Hogan talked about to make something better? I don't see how it can overturn the sort of structural inequalities and issues that I mentioned at the start. But it could certainly move a lot closer to being a fairer deal, a more transparent deal, and a better deal for the environment if a deal has to be done and is going to be done. So that and so these are some of the issues that we've raised in that, around transparency, around also human rights due diligence for supply chains, so some accountability for companies that are trading and particularly are based in the EU that will be importing beef and soy and other meats. In terms of inclusion, right the way back to the start of how the deals are done, that relevant parties, including indigenous groups and other stakeholders, are not being involved in the process of these deals, and that's a big problem. But also in terms of the enforcement, having binding legislation to enforce commitments and having participation by different stakeholders in that process of enforcement. All of those things are things that are largely missing from this deal as it stands, and are missing from most of these sorts of trade deals. Whether this deal, due to the level of opposition that it's facing, whether that might change, whether a different approach might be taken, and that remains to be seen. But at the very least, I think we could say that for the moment, signal that doing a deal with the Mercosur at a time when Bolsonaro is in power, when blatant attacks are taking place against indigenous peoples, when deforestation is on the rise, and when there are serious doubts as to the democratic nature of that government increasingly, I can't see how a deal can happen now at the very least. As for whether it should happen ever, that one, I think is something that needs to be discussed more broadly. So I'll finish there.
Okay. Thanks very much, Christopher, Luciana. So if anybody has any questions that wants to address to our panelists. Let's wait. Okay, we have one. Okay, we have one here. For both of you guys, which alternatives we could have to this deal? How can we create a new deal with the EU, which is respectful to the land and environment to the countries? Is that possible?
Well, do you want me to give some thoughts on this? Okay. No, I don't think that's possible. I mean, imagine that for the EU, the negotiation with Mercosur took these 20 plus 5 more years, because actually negotiations started in 1995, but they officially started once the Commission had, the Trade Commission had the mandate, the directives led by the European Council, and that only happened in 1999. And that's those directives, which is actually, it's not a public document. There was a leak, and we got the French version of the document, like 30 pages long. Those are the things that the European Council told the Commission that they wanted to actually negotiate. So you have there, well, we will negotiate services, and we will negotiate public procurement, and, well, no investment, because in 1999 the EU could not negotiate investments as a bloc. So you had only the bilateral investment treaties among the, for example, I know the Argentina, France, Argentina, Spain, Argentina, Italy, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so, but these directives are very clear, and trade, free trade is the core, yeah, it's the core directive of the directive. So if trade is the main focus, you will see that for 29th last year, they announced the ending of the negotiations. They announced last week, because it was last week, so it's like we're after the ending of the negotiations in 4 days' time. But 1 year after that, they ended the negotiations on the dialogues and cooperation chapters, which are completely not useful. I mean, void. I mean, completely not operational chapters, okay? Because this is not a speculation that I'm saying. I mean, cooperation and dialogue for the European Union are useless. We already saw this with the treaties or the agreements that are already in force with countries like Colombia or Ecuador or Peru or Chile or Mexico, where we know that even though you have these human rights provisions on these chapters, we know that Colombia or Mexico are the countries where more you have the biggest amount of deaths of journalists or of activists, human rights or environmental activists of the whole world. And the European Union has no problem to have trade agreements with those countries. So why should it have a problem, actually a moral problem or ethical problem, to have a deal with Brazil? So the main thing there is that while you have trade as the core part, where the big businesses are the ones that are going to win on the European side, and especially the German ones, which are the ones that are actually going to have big wins with this agreement, then there is no chance to have something alternative or to have more enforcement on environmental clauses, or to have a stronger precautionary principle, or to have environmental rights or human rights or whatever you like, whatever we would like, there is no chance we can have that in this agreement. So the only solution for this, the actual only solution for this is to say no to this agreement and then have a new set of directives for the Trade Commission to negotiate again. But imagine what that would look like. I mean, it's not politically feasible or possible to have in this condition, pandemic and economical crisis, and the US fighting China over trade, and the European Union doesn't have a good stand there. So it's not that easy to have let's have a new agreement. It won't be that easy, but what we know is that we have to say no to this agreement. So that is something that we know. Then we can, once we stop this agreement, then we can start talking about what we would like. But this is, I want to say this very clearly. For us, this is not an agreement that can be made better, okay, or made sweeter, or a little, I don't know, more beautiful, okay? It's not an agreement that is easy to be made better. It's a very bad agreement. It's a very bad agreement. So that's why Chris was saying this phrase of Helmut Scholz that I like. It's a lose-lose agreement. It's a lose-lose deal, right? So there is no way to make it better. Well, that's my point of, well, not my point of view only. I mean, there is a campaign on the Mercosur side. We already have this information on how the impacts of free trade agreements in Latin America have created a very big harm for societies here. We have 25 years of the NAFTA, right, of the North American Free Trade Agreement. So we know the impacts. We know 20 years of the European Union Mexico agreement, almost 20 years of the European Union Chile agreement. We know the impacts of those agreements. So it's not that's why I'm saying it's not a speculation. We know where we are. The thing is that, well, we have to make that information well known for people, so we don't rely on this good idea of liberalization and free trade and free markets that will bring benefits and prosperity and happiness to our peoples, right? I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I would largely agree with that. I think, as Luciana said, you know, the evidence of previous trade agreements is there to be seen. And I mentioned an example pre-free trade agreements, but in the 19th century. And you know, certainly not only that, but there is some evidence that these sorts of free trade agreements, but particularly between more industrialized countries and less industrialized, or global north and global south, whatever we want to say, is also associated with higher emissions levels as well, and lower environmental standards. I mean, I think the resistance to this agreement is certainly, I think, relatively significant. Now, there have been heavy resistance to other agreements too, and they've still gone ahead. But I think in particular here, and the interesting thing from an Irish perspective is that, you know, there is what has been traditionally quite a powerful lobby in Irish politics, and the farming lobby is fairly opposed to this. So that's interesting. And also, I think the moment that we're living in now, even just these last couple of years, in terms of the climate issues and the way that they've come to the fore in politics here, it's different. It's certainly different. I think this agreement, even a few years earlier, probably would have gone through relatively easily. So I do think that at the very least, you know, this agreement needs to be put on the agenda again and again, and to see. I do think that, you know, a new deal would need to be done. I don't see how you can. The other thing that could make things better would be and a different form of insertion into global markets for Latin America. But what exactly that would look like, that's a bigger issue. It's a more difficult issue. You know, in the 20th century, Latin America went through a period of sort of closing its borders and high tariff walls and trying to develop industry and that had some successes, but also some big weaknesses. And there was a sort of a weak attempt at that over the 10, 15 years of the left-wing governments, but that was largely undone by the commodities boom and the influx of China. But that is the other question. Then, we were talking about an EU deal. We can talk about democratic deficits, but there is some civil society engagement. There are legal challenges being brought. There are activist groups and parliamentary groups and so on are raising these issues. If the Mercosur does not do the deal with the EU, will it do a deal elsewhere where there will be none of that, and where all these bad impacts that we're talking about will happen anyway, without any safeguards whatsoever, without even lip service being paid them. So, I think it's a difficult one to say what's a best case scenario here, but certainly there have to be better ones than the deal that's on offer.
Thanks very much, Chris and Luciana. We have another question here. Could you talk more about investor-state dispute settlement, the ISDS, and how the EU is expanding this system around the world through free trade agreements and the danger it represents?
Yeah, I can talk a little about that, but we have to know that, I said before that this agreement in particular has no ISDS, has no investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. It has no investment chapter, although it treats services providers as investors, but it doesn't give them the possibility to go to, for example, the ICSID or arbitral tribunals, right? I don't know, Paris, New York, the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce. You don't have the possibility of doing that with this agreement. Although I will say this, what we know is that even though the same situation happened with the negotiations of the agreements, the original agreements with Mexico and with Chile, the European Union is now renegotiating or modernizing, or I don't know, making them more modern, these agreements that were signed in with Mexico. I think it was like in 2000 or 2001, and with Chile 2003 maybe. And so when they started modernizing these agreements, they are adding an investment chapter in particular. In the future, we know that the EU has been a very active actor in giving protection to their own investors, okay, around the world. What we saw is that the investment chapters were added also to new negotiations that took place, were not new now, I mean new in the recent years. For example, with Singapore and Vietnam, these chapters were added to the trade agreements, which are trade agreements, but they were added, they had this addition of investment chapters. And also we know that in pandemia, during the COVID pandemia, what we know is that the EU kept negotiating in the past 2 months, negotiating with China and with New Zealand and Australia, with China a bit directly. I mean, it's a bilateral investment treaty. With ISDS, well, we don't know there, because actually, for what I know, there is no information regarding what they are negotiating, and that's one of the problems we have. These are treaties where we don't usually know what they are negotiating until they finish the negotiation. So it's like, how can you as stakeholder or as civil society or academia have something to say when you have no access to anything of what they are negotiating? Nobody calls you to say, let's have a meeting and I will tell you we're negotiating and I want to know your opinion. No, that does not exist with these treaties. We already know that. And so regarding China, we don't know. And regarding the Australia and New Zealand, they are negotiating agreements. The European Union has been in the past 4 or 5 years with this Juncker Commission idea of having, no, not as commissioner, he had this idea of trade for all, where the European Union was a very strong actor in investment and trade area. And they especially wanted to have something to say in this US-China struggle, economic struggle, as the EU was being left outside the big competition. So they started moving forward, especially the Southeast Asian countries, where you have the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You have that actually with no US after Donald Trump, but you have the TPP, is 11 countries now, and you have the RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that is led by China and India also, but China especially. So you have the EU, they are trying to be a very important actor in the trade and investment sector. And the last thing that I want to say regarding that is that even though there has been so much criticism to ISDS, to investor-state dispute settlement mechanism by the European civil society, there has been a very strong campaign against this mechanism. This mechanism is turning against the European countries now through the, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Energy Charter Treaty. Countries like Spain are very, very strongly being, are receiving claims by foreign investors, which are European investors. Also, the case of this Vattenfall against Germany. I mean, you have a lot of countries now, investors from European countries suing European countries. So you're now seeing the backlash of the system coming to Europe when it was usually the European investors suing other countries like Argentina or many countries in the region, and but we have that now. So this is it's the whole system that is really biased for corporate and investors' interests, and not for human rights or environment, of course. That's it.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say much about that. I think Luciana knows a lot more than I do, but yeah, I mean, just in terms of that, you know, I think that there is that sort of geographic regional aspect of it, you know, where it's ISDS as companies from largely from the global north, often suing countries in the global south, but of course they can also sue countries in the global north. And so it's not only about regions and geography, but also about private versus public, you know, where if you have a company that sues a country, the money that they get then is taxpayer money. So yeah, I think that's an important aspect to mention as well. And all of that money, of course, closes off possibilities for investment in basic services like education, like health, like potable water. I think the Transnational Institute said maybe 30 million, is it, Luciana, that's gone from Latin American countries to corporations under ISDS.
Okay, thanks, Christopher and Luciana again. We have another question here. Why it was so easy from part of EU to ignore all the resistance by environmental groups? Does this mean there are fundamentally corrupt aspects in the EU? And what do you think about civil disobedience as a model of addressing and resisting these kind of things?
Yeah, I don't know. Corruption is always one of those words. It's a difficult one, right? So, you know, if it happens in Latin America or Africa, it's corruption. If it happens in Europe, it's business or lobbying or something like that. But yeah, I mean, I think that I think part of the problem, you know, with all of this is the way in which the deals are negotiated behind closed doors. So very difficult to get much in the way of activism going around something that you have very little information about. I think there has been, you know, some response from environmental groups and a range of other groups. I mentioned the Greens, you know, in terms of trying to bring pressure on this now that the details are out there. And I don't think there is any one way, you know, that you tackle something like this. I think it's about agenda setting. A lot of it, you know, it's about putting these concerns on the agenda and shining a light on these sort of details, and doing it on a continual basis and at different levels. Certainly, the environmental movement in Ireland and the farming movement would be odd sort of partners, and not necessarily traditional partners. But you know, I think that they can maybe find common ground on this issue. And so, I mean, civil disobedience. You know, I think the Extinction Rebellion has, and groups like that have certainly been responsible for putting the wider climate crisis on the agenda. But the other thing, of course, that's putting the climate crisis on the agenda is the breakdown of the climate. You know, and so you know, I'm not sure what's pushing what, but certainly, you know, I think there's a comment there from Laura Keogh, who's the lead author of that paper that I mentioned, you know, saying that for all of the other aspects of this, that you know the ION is at a tipping point, and if there's a potential for the EU to intervene to do something to avert that, then you know, maybe this leverage can be used. But I still think there's a long way to go to show that, first of all, that it has that leverage, and second of all, that it's interested in using it to that end, because there is not a lot of evidence to back up that contention. So right now, it's a potential point of pressure, and I think for activists, potential points of pressure should always be explored. But yeah, it's an unproven one to date, I would say.
Yeah, I would like to add to that. I agree there. But I was wondering about this thing of corruption, right? I don't think it's corruption. I think that from the EU's side is that the EU creates, I mean, all the states have to create the conditions for their companies to win abroad, right? That's what they have been doing for the past 25, 30 years. After actually the first BITs, the first bilateral investment treaties, are like 35, 40 years old. And Germany and Switzerland were the big players in that. They have like, Germany has like something like 130, if I'm not mistaken, 135 bilateral investment treaties signed and enforced. I mean, Germany is the country that has created the biggest network of treaties for their own companies to play abroad and have protection for their investments. I mean, let's think about BASF, about Siemens, about I don't know, whichever you like, Bayer, the pharmaceuticals. I mean, they're big players in this game. So it's not corruption. The thing is that there is a we have Thomas Fritz. He's a specialist that actually has created a report that was published last week, something like that, with Greenpeace in Germany, and he said that there is a corporate capture of all the civil societies and all the subcommittees and all the spaces where you can participate. There is a corporate capture by corporations. There is a capture by corporation, and there is a deficit of democracy. What Chris was saying about that, you have a deficit there. I mean, actually the only stakeholders that are important, it's not the human rights movements or Extinction Rebellion. I mean, they can put pressure, but we know that the ones that they want to have a dialogue with is the lawyers from the corporations, and it is with them. I mean, there are examples of lots of leaks that show that many of the, and in the United States, it's more clear. For example, with the TISA, with the Trade and Investment, with the Trade and Services, Trade in Services Agreement, the TISA is a plurilateral agreement that was never finally approved. But you have the text there. There are many people that have said, and documents that show that Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, these companies are the ones that actually have a dialogue with negotiators. We don't have dialogue with negotiators. That happens in the US, that happens in the EU, that happens in Argentina. I mean, so this is the situation we have. So it's not a thing of corruption, it's a thing of interest. We have to show something different, other interests, if we want to create something different, because otherwise we are far behind in putting our agenda on the top of the table, right? That's it.
Thanks very much to both of you. We have another question here. What do you think of the role of China in Latin America? It's influencing deals like Mercosur?
I don't know there. I mean, the role of China, because you have, for example, if you see, China is the second or first, it depends on the country, is the first or second trade associate, no, it won't be associate, partner, buyer of the things coming from the agricultural sector in countries like Argentina or Brazil. It's the first or second buyer of many of the products we produce in the region. So it's a huge player in trade issues, but for the Mercosur-EU agreement, I would say that it doesn't have such an impact because it is the longest agreement in negotiation. That's not a good phrase, sorry, but it's the agreement that has taken the longest to conclude. That's the idea. And so that was before even China became a big player here. For me, it's like what we have is the role of Bolsonaro there, which is really important to see. We have Bolsonaro wanting to now to have trade agreements with all the world, with the US including. And what we see also is that the role of Bolsonaro now is to open and liberalize the Brazilian economy, something that has not been done yet, which is huge because Brazil is enormous. I mean, it's a huge economy. What I have been told in the past months that even though you don't have free trade agreements yet working, Bolsonaro has already opened the tenders for airports, roads, tolls, ports. I mean, they're opening up for private sector. Chris was saying about that. It's a struggle between public and private. It is like that. Bolsonaro is getting everything out of the public sector and putting everything out there for private corporations. And so imagine for German, for example, or French, or Spanish, or from Spain, or Italian corporations relating to services sector. They are already working in Argentina from the 90s, but they are like vampires. They are ready to get their teeth on Brazil's enormous, big, huge public sectors and public services. So that is what I think that is more important in this case. They want to enter Brazil, and they're trying to do that with this agreement.
Okay, thanks very much, Luciana. We have a comment here from Laura Keowe. I hope that my pronunciation is the right one. And she comments like, right now it's a terrible deal, but with pressure on the EU at the time of the EU Green Deal, maybe a far stricter, completely new kind of trade deal could be developed.
I don't agree there. I don't agree with that idea. I know that there has been lots of that has been said that with trade agreements you can create enforcement on, for example, the compromises made by countries in the Paris Agreement, for example. I don't agree there. I mean, look at Bolsonaro. I mean, it's impossible. It's impossible to have a trade agreement stop or push for Bolsonaro to respect the Paris Agreement when he has a society there. It's like an illegal society. It's like he has a partnership a political partnership with agribusiness, who are the ones that are not going to allow you to respect the Paris Agreement, because they are the ones that are advancing and moving forward inside the Amazonas and helping deforestation. And also that happens in Argentina. I mean, it's not only Brazil. I know that from the point of view of Europe, the focus is on the big Amazonas and the big scandal of the fires in August last year, for example. But in Argentina, the past 20 years, you have a huge deforestation process. And the authorities in Argentina have already said that there is no way they can guarantee that the soy coming, for example, that is exported to the UK, for example, because the example was with Tesco, especially with Tesco. Tesco said that they could not guarantee, because the Argentine authorities could not guarantee that the soy that they were selling inside the UK didn't come from the forested areas. There is no way to guarantee that. So what are we talking about? I mean, how could these trade agreements guarantee this? If you read the agreement between Mercosur and the EU, you will see there is nothing that says that you are obliged, you're forced to have traceability of the soy that comes to the European Union. There's nothing like that. So I mean, that's why I say this agreement there is no way to make this agreement better. You need a new agreement, but a new agreement where you don't have human rights and environmental rights as soft law. You need that as hard law. You need corporate accountability. You don't have anything of that sort in any of these agreements, especially in this one. There's no corporate accountability of the sort. There is nothing. Only the states are the ones to guarantee certain things, but there is nothing to say about what they have to do and what they have to respect. So we need a new agreement. I don't think that there is any chance to have pressure on Bolsonaro and his policies on environment with this agreement. Sorry, I don't agree about that. Of course, that is my position.
Yeah, I mean, it's just to repeat what I said. I mean, I think again, it's theoretically, that these things could happen, and because of the situation in the Amazon at the moment, because of how precarious it is with this threat of dieback, that where the Amazon will convert from being a carbon sink into a net carbon emitter, it's certainly important, I think, to explore any possibilities of that nature. But if you look, again, if you look at the politics of it at the moment, which I think is what Luciana is saying too, that I don't see that the politics are there. And obviously, we can point to Bolsonaro as a key element of that. The government in Argentina seems to be a more reasonable one now than under Macri. But we need to look at the EU side as well. Why wasn't this deal done when we had broadly left-wing governments in Latin America? I'm running up against the limits of my knowledge there. I don't know the exact reasons why it wasn't done, but I'm guessing that the sort of things that they were looking for weren't the sort of things that the EU wanted to give. And so, again, we go back to the proof of the EU's real commitment to commitment to the environment and commitment to human rights. I mean, at best, I think we could see a disconnect within the EU. That's being least cynical, that's saying that there are parts of the EU that are doing that, and that there are parts of the EU that are doing trade, and there seems to be a big disconnect between them at the very least.
Thanks very much. And we have another question, comment here. Has there been a substantial movement towards a change in the format of FTAs to include fairer terms for environmental and human rights? The EU and other powerful blocs seem to have a very hypocritical position on these issues. The EU condemns human rights abuses, but trades with countries and facilitates trade for companies with very questionable practices, similarly for environmental issues.
Yeah, it's like that. I mean, it's not a question. I mean, I agree there. That's what I was saying before. I mean, that's why we have to completely take out everything of that's why of morals or ethics or human rights from the European Union's position when they negotiate. I mean, there's nothing of the sort. There is an example, for example, that we have been following in the past 2 years. The Peruvian movement, the social and trade unions in social movements and trade unions in Peru tried to use the political dialogue clauses of their agreement with the EU to try to push the Peruvian government. This was like 2 years ago, yes. The Peruvian government, in order to say, so it said to the EU, hey, listen, our government is not respecting labor rights and environmental rights. So they started this big movement to try to use the clauses inside the agreement and to push for the European Commission. In that moment, we had Cecilia Malmström as the trade commissioner, and they started sending letters and saying, "Hey, European Union, I mean, you said that you were going to guarantee the respect of environment and labor rights as it is said in these political dialogue clauses." And so they sent some letters. Letters came and went, and the final letter is from 1 year ago, April 2019, and the European Commission finally said, well, something like this. I will of course say it in a different way than the Commission, but it said like, sorry, I mean, we understand your struggles, and we understand that maybe you're right, but there is nothing we can do. So this is the final response from the Commission to the Peruvian movement that tried to use the clauses inside the trade agreement in favor of human rights, not especially, yes, human rights, because labor rights are human rights, and environmental rights. So that's what we have there. We have a situation where we already know, I mean, this has already been used, that this is useless. So that's why we say it's useless. So let's stop pretending that if you add more beautiful clauses of human rights something, this will actually work, because what is enforceable are the trade chapters. Those are the strong chapters inside the agreement, and these agreements have no they pay no attention to actually those rights. That's why you can have, as I said before, agreements with Colombia, with Mexico, and nothing happens. Nothing happens, and you say, well, I mean, there is no doubt about Mexico or Colombia, right? I mean, so imagine Brazil. It's the same situation. Why should it be different? No, I'm just trying to show the whole picture there. In the case of Latin America, in our web page, I wrote it before, America Latina sin TLC.org. It's in Spanish, sorry, but it's for Latin Americans. But you will find there, we have all these reports created by the Peruvian movements, by Redge, showing all these situations. So we already have that on record. So we can understand how it could work for this situation of Mercosur-EU also.
Yeah, thanks. I don't have much to add to that, but I do think that the legal aspects of any of these agreements are really subject to the politics in the end. You know, really these are political agreements. You know, if a country decides not to honor the terms, you know, what are the penalties for that? Really, it's about it's a cost benefit analysis, isn't it? And so, you know, we have had countries that have broken agreements, and we've had agreements that have been, at the very least, taken off the agenda, like the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, due to huge social mobilization and protest movements across Latin America. And so, you know, it is, but there does seem to be, again, some evidence that trade agreements between, if you like, more equal partners, so like global South trade agreements, or trade agreements more between northern countries, tend to work out a little bit better, you know. So really, you know, we're talking about these historically established power differentials or power asymmetries between dependent regions like Latin America and the EU. And so, I mean, that's at the core of everything, really. You know, but certainly from a European perspective, the more we can try to hold the EU to the standards that it espouses, I think the better, you know. And so again, it's about shining light on these contradictions, questioning these contradictions, because the EU does espouse to be more than just we're going to do whatever we think we can get away with. You know, it does espouse to be more than that. And yet the experience of places like Mexico and so on is that the EU really is just about getting as much as it can, and whatever, and getting away with whatever it thinks it can get away with. And so, you know, that there's that's on us in a way in terms of being in Europe to try to hold that more to account.
Okay, thanks very much. That was our last question. Thanks once again. Thanks very much for this such an interesting conference, and for all the people who was involved with us through this webinar. And to the Irish Aid and our sponsor, all the people involved to make this webinar happen, and these type of events, we want to say thank you. Our panelists have shared some useful information, some links. If you want to check on the chat, please. Also, I would like to remind you that tomorrow, this webinar is going to be on our YouTube channel, LASC YouTube channel. There is a feedback, a short feedback form that if please can you fill up, that will help us a lot for the next event. Tomorrow you will receive a record of this webinar in your emails. Also, I would like to invite you to check our social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our website, which is www.lasc.ie. And if you want to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, and if you want to participate with us, also you can send us an email there. And if you want to contribute for more events like this, you can be members of LASC for 10 euros per year. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias, Luciana.
Gracias a todos.
Great to meet you, Chris.
Yeah, likewise, Luciana.